You are lying on the couch on a Sunday afternoon. Nothing is due. Nothing is on fire. You've finished what you had to finish. You are allowed to be here. And yet something is wrong. Not a problem you can point to, not a task left undone, just a low-grade unease that starts rising the longer you sit still. The kind that says, you should be doing something. You should be doing something with this. Most people who feel this already know it well enough to have a name for it. Some call it guilt. Some call it anxiety. Some just call it how they are. What they rarely ask is where that feeling came from, or why it doesn't seem to hit everyone the same way. He texts his friend Saturday morning. Nothing planned today, finally. By noon, he has cleaned the backyard, meal prepped for the week, answered 3 non-urgent emails, and opened a course he signed up for 3 months ago and never once touched. His friend replies around 2 p.m. Just woke up. What are you up to? He types, just catching up on some stuff. Then stares at it for a second. Because what he wanted to type was nothing. But nothing didn't feel true. Nothing felt like an admission. He was not busy. He was performing busyness, first for himself, then briefly for someone else. That difference is where the whole pattern lives. It is not just weekends. It shows up on vacation, when the laptop stays in the bag but the mind doesn't. It shows up in the middle of a movie when the hand reaches for the phone, not because anything is there, but because stillness started feeling like a question that needed answering. It shows up in how they talk about rest. Millennials, broadly speaking, do not say they rested. They say they recharged. They recovered. They needed a reset. The language is functional. The frame is efficiency. The implication is that the rest had a purpose, that it led somewhere useful, that it was not wasted. Because rest without a purpose, rest as a thing that simply is, rarely sits comfortably. The stillness arrives, and almost immediately something asks, is this okay? Should I be doing something right now? That question, that quiet, recurring question, that is the pattern. Somewhere across the same city, someone 5 years younger sits in almost the same position. Same Saturday afternoon, same quiet apartment, and does not feel the question at all. He knows he is not doing anything productive. He is fully aware of the unfinished assignment, the unanswered text, the dish from last night still in the sink. He sees all of it, and he stops anyway. Not because he is lazy, not because he doesn't care about those things, but because somewhere in how he understands himself, rest does not require justification. It is not a reward earned after enough output. It is not a signal of failure. It is just what his body decided to do at 2 p.m. on a Saturday. Gen Z did not escape pressure. They carry enormous amounts of it. Financial anxiety, a climate that feels unstable, a future that looks nothing like the one they were promised. But many of them learned something millennials were never quite taught, that stopping is not the same as falling behind. There is a version of rest that is chosen, not collapsed into. That is what it looks like from the outside, when you don't share the internal equation that makes stopping feel dangerous. Millennials came of age in 2 major economic dislocations within 15 years. The first was the dot-com crash. The second, and the one that shaped the generation's relationship to work more than anything else, was 2008. Many were entering the job market exactly when the job market stopped accepting people. What that moment taught people was simple. Security was not guaranteed, that credentials were not enough, that you had to distinguish yourself constantly from the people around you who also needed work and also had degrees and also were trying. Hustle culture did not invent itself. It was a response. For millennials, productivity became a form of self-protection, a way of staying relevant, staying hireable, staying ahead of a system that had already shown it would not catch them if they fell. The guilt came later, not as a design, as a residue. Psychology has a name for this kind of gentleness toward yourself. But hearing the term and feeling allowed to live by it are not the same thing. Millennials grew up in an environment where worth was consistently tied to output. Not in those words, not usually explicitly, but in practice. In the praise they received for grades and achievements, in the way adults treated work ethic as a moral quality, in the implicit message that a person who was not striving was a person who was slipping. The result is a relationship with rest that is never quite neutral. Resting feels fine when it follows enough work. It feels fine when it is brief. But rest that extends, rest that stretches into the afternoon without a plan, begins to register as something other than rest. It begins to register as failure. This is not laziness in disguise. This is what happens when an entire generation internalizes productivity as proof of worth, and then cannot locate the off switch for a rule they never consciously agreed to follow. That is not a character flaw. That is conditioning. The most common misread is the one millennials apply to themselves. They call the guilt responsibility. They call the compulsion discipline. They tell themselves the reason they cannot fully stop is because they care about their work, about their goals, about not becoming someone who lets things slide. And it is partly true, but only partly, because what they are not naming is the fear underneath it. The fear that if they stop, something will be revealed. Not a late deadline, something quieter. Something about whether they are enough, independent of what they are producing. The cross-generational misread runs in the opposite direction. Millennials watch Gen Z rest without apparent guilt and read it as indifference, as a lack of urgency, as the behavior of a generation that hasn't yet experienced what it costs to fall behind. What they are actually seeing is a different relationship to self-worth. Not an absence of ambition, not naivety. A generation that, whether from therapy, from watching their predecessors burn out, or simply from being born into a world where hustle culture had already begun showing its damage, in many cases became less willing to let their last productive hour decide what they were worth. That is not the same as not caring. It is just a different internal equation. The cost of this pattern is not productivity. Millennials, as a group, are not underperforming. If anything, the opposite. The cost is something smaller and harder to measure. It is the quality of rest when it finally arrives. The way a Saturday can pass, full of motion and small tasks, and leave behind a particular kind of fatigue. Not the fatigue of having done too much, the fatigue of never having fully let go. It is what happens to the people nearby. The way you can be in the same room as someone and sense that one part of him is always elsewhere, present in body, somewhere else in mind. Not because he doesn't value the time, but because the part of him that monitors output never fully clocked out. And over time, the identity narrows. What I do and who I am become harder and harder to separate, until any threat to the doing registers quietly as a threat to the being. That is a fragile place to live. What Gen Z figured out, some of them, and not easily, is not that rest is earned or owed. It is that productivity cannot be the only language through which a person proves he exists. That is not a lesson that arrives from a single realization. It arrives, if it arrives at all, from a long, uncomfortable look at the internal equation you have been running. The one that says, when I produce, I am real. When I stop, I am in question. The guilt millennials feel when they rest is not irrational. It made complete sense inside the world that made them. The question is only whether that equation still holds, whether the rules written for a version of life that was already unstable are worth keeping as permanent ones. Not every pause is a warning. Stopping for one afternoon is not failure dressed in comfortable clothes. It might just be an afternoon.